Welcome back to another episode of Shashank Redemption. I am super excited about my guest today. His name is Gregory Shepard, and he has a pretty impressive bio. I won't be able to read through the entire thing, otherwise I'll be using probably the entire time of the episode talking about it. But Greg is a 20-year startup veteran, social entrepreneur. He has had 14 liquidity events under his belt, two of which were sold as part of 925 million transaction that won 4P awards for transactions between 250 million and $1 billion. He's a published author, has written over 100 articles for national and international publications, a TEDx speaker, keynote, not just for events, but also at universities. And he is also the host of Meet the Boss, Forbes radio show. So kind of a podcast, but on typical radio show on Forbes. He also co-founded Boss Capital Partners, which is where we will be spending a lot of time discussing about his philosophy around investing, around starting Boss Capital Partners. So as I said, very long resume and extremely impressive. So welcome to the show, Greg.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And great introduction.
You're welcome. I'm only speaking the truth. So let's first talk about your journey, Greg. I mean, we will of course get into your current company that you run, which is Boss Capital Partners. But what led you to founding and starting Boss Capital Partners? Tell us about your professional journey, so to say, leading up to about what I think 2019 when you founded Boss Capital Partners.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that I started about, I think close to 30 years ago, I started building businesses. I think when I was 20, I did a bank. And then right after that, I did a environmental applied biotechnology company. And then the following company, when the internet came out, everything was software or internet based. I have autism and dyslexia. And so it's been quite a struggle in the beginning.
Wow.
You know, trying to get going because I barely graduated from high school, but I have this thing called savant syndrome, which allows me to, I have some superpowers and, you know, and I think I found my little niche in the world, you know, doing these startups. So I, you know, built and sold all these different companies, you know, ranging from, I mean, I don't even list all the ones that I did that were small. Those are bigger ones. And usually I have more than one company going at the same time. I put together this thing called the Business Operating Support System. That's what BOSS stands for.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And so what I did is early on, I started finding the algorithms in the different, what I call operating systems. So this is like Lean, Six Sigma, Agile, 4DX, OGSM, all those different systems. And I started playing with the different tools. And over about 20 years, I found out which tools worked at what stages in the life cycle of business. So yeah, so like something like Six Sigma, which is more about, you know, creating standardization and optimization on current processes, is later in the stages. And something like 4DX, which is more like, what do I do today and how do I separate urgent from important and impact over effort sort of matrices. And that's sort of more of an early stage operating system. And so I sort of combined them all and created some of my own systems and then used those to build all these businesses. And, you know, through that process, I mean, I was a chairman for congressional candidates. I've got to meet Barack Obama twice.
Wow.
Yeah, really incredibly cool guy, by the way. I mean, just really neat person. And then build all these businesses and, you know, invest in a whole bunch of companies. And then I created a school that's startupscience.io. And the school powers universities, accelerators, incubators, visa programs, economic development programs. Boss Capital Partners, which is where we can select startups that we feel are good companies and then make capital investments into those businesses, and then help the entrepreneurs following that.
Very cool. So 2 points of similarities there. I out of my business school, I worked for GE, and they were huge on Six Sigma. That's something which was kind of drilled into us. And of course, as you mentioned, that was a much late stage company. I mean, so late that they had hundreds and thousands of employees.
Yeah.
But Six Sigma was a big play at GE for us. And that was kind of a good place to work, actually, straight out of business school, to understand how efficiencies work. And then I had the honor and the privilege of meeting President Obama once as well. And as you said, a very cool guy. I mean, my name is not that easy to pronounce, and he made sure that he knew exactly how to pronounce it and made as if we were high school buddies. So even though it was only for a very short while. So yeah, totally agree how cool the president was. So
yeah, and Six Sigma is an interesting operating system because and it's really cool that did you do it under Jack Welch?
that's correct. Jack Welch.
Oh man, he's the master of Six Sigma. So, I mean, you had some of the best training. You're probably a black belt if you were at GE. So well done, sir. Well done.
Exactly. Yeah. Good learning there for sure. So you were talking about some of the things that you have near perfected through all these years of figuring out what works when. So if that's the case, I mean, would you go as far as to say that there is actually a formula for a startup successes? Because I mean, 70-80% of them don't even make it to year 3 or year 4.
Yeah, so I'll tell you something. What I did is after I had a couple of exits from eBay, and then we did this big carve out, turnaround, roll up thing. Big, huge project. That's a whole nother podcast, but
sure.
But
we can get into one of these case studies and kind of drill deeper in one of the future episodes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that thing was a monster project. And so in that project, I was able to really step away. And when I stepped away, I wanted to try to give back. I came from an American poor family, not a third world poor family, but American poor. Mm-hmm. And we didn't have any money, and my parents had adopted and fostered kids, and so I grew up differently, different nationalities in a different economic environment. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to give back. And I wrote this article called Altruistic Capitalism, which is using capitalism for altruistic outcomes for Forbes. And when I did that, I was like, okay, I'm gonna come through on this, right? So I went into politics, and I was the chairman for congressional candidates and senators and trying to help them out. And then we had an election that broke my heart and just shattered my view of politics. And so I said, okay, well, what am I going to do? I want to help. And so I was actually meditating at the beach, and it came to me. I was like, well, I've been doing these businesses all this time. Why don't I start a school? Why don't I teach them these algorithms that I've learned? Yeah. And to your point, it is a science. That's why that business is called Startup Science, because it absolutely, the art is coming up with the idea, the vision, and there are certain things like focus, drive, enthusiasm, discipline, and optimism that are an art, but the science is actually the process of going through a business. When I left politics, I did a study. I hired 5 people. I spent like $500,000 of my own money and investigated, to your point, why 90% of entrepreneurs fail over 5 years, and why 57.7% of them fail in the first year.
Yep.
And so what I learned is that the final 4 years, the remaining of the founders, most of them fail for things that they actually did in the first year, but didn't affect them in the first year. There was latency in the results that made their startups crash. And so then I was like, okay, well, what if I just took this and overlaid it over the life cycle of businesses? The life cycle of businesses is from vision to product to go-to-market to standardization, optimization, and then you get into growth and exit. And those stages were put together based on overlaying the reasons why entrepreneurs fail, the different operating systems, and the orientation of the different rounds that typically happen over a period of time. And then I started to create courses and classes and different tools that help these founders through each stage of that, before and after each round, to help them not fail for the same reasons other founders have for the last 15 years,
That is amazing, because I mean, to think that there could be science behind something that fails 95 out of 100 times in a 5-year period is just stunning, and something I'll probably check out myself a little later after we are done with this call. But you did mention about some of the mistakes that founders make over and over again, and that's they're probably not learning from other founders. They are sometimes not learning just from themselves. Maybe a mistake that they did, and they're repeating it. What, in your experience, are some of those things that you would say probably encompasses most of the people that you see who had the talent, who had the drive, who had the desire, but has still failed ultimately?
I think that, it's really interesting. I mean, we had like hundreds of thousands of papers. I did 1,200 one-on-one interviews with founders that made it in different. I interviewed the Navy SEALs, the CIA,
Wow.
the SWAT teams, the first fighting week, the Air Force, smoke jumpers from the fire department. And I learned all these ways that they handle emergency situations and still maintain to keep their team intact, even though everybody is in an urgent situation constantly. And that added some insights into how, sort of what lens I look at the data. Because sometimes, in the initial questions we ask are, multiple choice, and they'll say something like, well, I didn't get funded. And then you have to ask, then you have to go into the 5 whys, which you're familiar from the Toyota production system, which created lean. And you say, well, why didn't you get funded? Well, because we didn't have our revenue goals, or whatever the answer was. So each one of these took on their own path, right? So then you're like, okay, well, why didn't you hit your revenue goals? And then why and why and why? Really what you end up with is all these sort of patterns. Like if you were to look at a bubble chart combined with a line graph, right? And you sort of see these patterns that emerge, and it's really obvious. And you come out with a few different themes. And I can tell you that the 2 most dominant themes that I see throughout the whole process is bad advice is a huge one. It shows up almost in every case. They took bad advice from a mentor. They took bad advice from an investor. They took bad advice from somebody in their family or their friend group or some other entrepreneur. It is a serious issue. And I always tell founders, I'm like, if you're in an accelerator, and accelerators are fantastic. They really are. Most of them. Not all of them, but most of them, right? And if you go into an accelerator, and you got to be really careful, those people have a really hard time trying to find mentors, right? So sometimes the mentors they get are actually looking for either a deal, they're an investor, or they're looking for a consultant job or a customer if they're an accountant or something, or a lawyer or something like that. And sometimes they're another founder that's a one-hit wonder, or something like that. And then they're listening to this advice, or maybe, it's a founder who's done 3 startups in a different vertical, or it's a founder, but they specialize in the vision stage and they're not really engineers, or they're not really financial, or whatever it is, right? And so you got to be really careful, because there isn't one mentor. There are mentors depending on the vertical and the subject matter that you're in. And that's one thing that really helps founders not make the mistake of getting bad advice. And the other one that shows up almost every single time is exit strategy. So a lot of people don't, I got into a lot of art. I was at TechCrunch a couple of weeks ago, and it's big on a panel arguing with an investor about this. And I say, you need to plan your exit strategy from the beginning. And they'll say, well, it's too early. You don't know what it is, blah, 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 blah. But here's the thing that really seems to resonate and shut down that argument is that the companies that make acquisitions, they either buy a company to save or make money, right? And that we all know. And that's the synergy, right? So most of the time what they're doing is they're acquiring other companies to make more money. The reason why is because they've invested however much money and however many customers over time. So they have an ICP and a persona that's, set, a stack of different ICPs and personas that are in their worldview. And if your company can't line up with that ICP and persona, you're just not an acquisition for them. Because you haven't proven that they can get a CAC to LTV, right? They can grow their LTV and they've already absorbed the CAC. So it's pure profit if they acquire the company outside of the cost of acquisition. So if that's then the case, then it makes perfect logical sense to say that if from the beginning you don't align your company ICP and persona with your acquirers, you could spend 5 years building a company and not have a buyer. And because essentially your whole company is just a product to them, because most of the time they don't care about your customers. They have all the customers they need, right? What they're really after is it possible for us then to make it so that your product can be purchased by our customers? So if you look around the world at all the big companies that are making acquisitions, that's the story. So if you don't plan that from the beginning, it means you could raise money, do your go-to-market, go crazy, growing like the investors tell you. And then when you get out to that exit, you're sitting there, with your hands in your pockets going, I have to start all over. Or 3 years later, you talk to an investor or an acquisition partner and, oh, sorry, your ICP doesn't match. And sometimes they won't even tell you that. But you never build a product without having a customer. So if your whole company is a product to your acquirer, why would you build a company without having an acquirer in mind? Therefore, the customer and the acquirer are tied together, which is something you start to build from the very beginning.
Yeah, that is a crazy thought, so to say, is to say that not just because I've heard before is that you need to plan for your exit very early in the process, but this is the first time I'm hearing where you are not just planning for the exit, you're even planning for the potential acquirers. You are saying these are the 5 potential players who could be acquiring. What is it that they are missing that I need to build instead of overlay on what they already have, and thus waste my time and potentially have even less value for the company because we are not building for them. That's a very interesting idea. Is given your 14 liquidity events, Greg, is that your greatest, say, exit strategy or how to plan for it, or will there be anything else that you would say for startup founders who are very early in their stage?
I think that you need to plan that up front, right? I mean, that's just you just need to, even if it changes, you have to be directionally correct, at least in the first place, right? I call it your North Star. And if you're trying to cross the ocean and you're off by 1%, you're going to be on another continent, right? So you need to know 2 things. You need to know where you are and you need to know where you're going. And the where you're going is the exit strategy, and people don't plan for that. That's a really powerful statement, and I hope they really take that to heart.
Yeah.
The other thing is to understand the mechanical drivers of a business throughout its process of raising cash, getting funded, and surviving through things like what's happening now in the market, and then eventually getting to an exit. And that is that growth, margin, and retention are the big value drivers, right? So everybody looks at growth, margin, and retention. And underneath that then are your functional areas. So your functional areas are these heads of the different departments. Those functional area leaders must be tied directly to the value drivers. So for example, sales and marketing is growth. Shared services would be margin, and service would be retention, right? And product and engineering is across the whole stack, right? I mean, they're always present throughout everything. So if you build your functional areas so they align with the valuation drivers, then you can build lead and lag KPIs underneath those valuation drivers. So another problem that I see all over the place is, and I mean, this is still really common, and I mean, every day I see this constantly. And it's where the investors and the investors shape the founders into looking and driving their business based on financials. So they'll sit there and say, okay, let's look at the P&L. Let's look at your balance sheet. Let's run the numbers, blah, blah, blah. And the bottom line is that if you're running your business looking at financials, it's like driving the car looking at your rearview mirror, because the financials started 6 months ago. So if you're sitting there going, okay, I'm going to build based on the financials, you're always building on the past. You should be building on what creates the financials. So financials are a lagging indicator, full stop. The leading indicators are the parts that create the financials, and the financials create the valuation drivers. So if you start by saying, one of my financial drivers is growth. So then I go, okay, I go down to my growth number and I say, okay, what is my percentage of growth up against whatever benchmark? What creates growth? Well, what creates growth is demos. Let's say you're doing sales demos. Well, what creates sales demos? Marketing, collateral, demand generation, whatever it is. And you start at that point. I call it pulling the thread. If you run that thread, think it's going through a sweater, right? And the sweater is like the fabric of your business. And you pull that thread, then as a CEO, you can always pull the thread from throughout the whole business. And I learned this the hard way, because after, as a CEO, when you have like a few hundred employees, 500-600 employees, it becomes extremely difficult to affect the business like you could when you were doing a startup.
Yeah.
You notice this happen straight away. I mean, probably around 10 people is when you start to feel like you're losing control of what's happening down on the ground. And the only way to structure the ability for you to do that is by having that thread that you can pull. And that thread weaves starting from the valuation drivers through the financial KPIs, and then ultimately through the lead KPIs. And if you do that correctly, then you will have the ability to run your business and keep running it as if you're a real founder, as if you're a startup. Once a company stops being a startup, they won't get acquired. I mean, big corporations, they don't innovate. I mean, if you look around at every big company in the Fortune 500, they buy innovation. I mean, even Apple bought Siri, right?
Yep.
So, they all buy innovation because they're terrible at it. And the reason why they're terrible at it is because they can't master pulling the string, because the fabric of their business is like this tapestry that goes on for miles, and it's all over the place. But if you have the ability to pull the string on your business all the way up until acquisition, you can figure out how you can weave into their business. So another huge issue that I see is the founders losing control of their own business. And this is relevant in one of the other things that come up. This is the third one that comes up all the time, which is the team. So they'll say, well, how come you failed? Well, the team. Well, what do you mean the team? What it comes down to is a series of things that wrap around things like, the team burned out. Well, why did they burn out? Well, they didn't have a passion about what they were doing. Well, then you hired the wrong person. Or, well, the team didn't perform the way I wanted them to perform. Well, you're the one, your only job as a CEO is to get your team to perform, right? So, that has something to do with the way you handled it as a CEO, or the way that you trained the people that are working underneath you to conduct those processes. And then, couldn't scale the company. Well, you should have saw that coming a long time ago if you went through standardization and optimization like the Six Sigma process.
Yep.
There's a lot of things that, that you see throughout a business that are, that's three of them. There's five big ones, but that's three of them that I can tell you almost occur every single time. Like in the data, it's like almost every single time it shows up.
Yeah, that makes sense. You refer to the investors looking mostly at the lagging indicator, which is the financials. You also penned a recent article that suggested investors are not your friends. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, it's like I tell, so I'll give you an example. My older daughter was going to go buy a car, and she was like, "Oh, the guy's so nice. The guy's so nice. The guy selling me the car so nice." And I'm like, "Yeah, listen, he's a nice person, and you can separate the human being from the initiative. The fact of the matter is he wants to sell you the car for the most he can get, and you want to buy the car for as little as you can, so you don't have aligned interests. This is the same with an investor. Investor wants to get the lowest valuation they can. They want to throw in preferences. They're trying to make money, and you're trying not to give away equity. You're trying to have the opposite effect, right? Raise the valuation, reduce preferences, or no preferences, and so on and so forth. So, the investors oftentimes will say, "Oh, no, we're on the same page because if we sell this, we both make money." that side of the argument is true, but it depends on who you're talking to. If you're talking to somebody that is running a VC or a micro VC or an angel group or syndicate, something like that, they get paid whether or not the investors make money or not. They're getting 2 and 20. They're getting 2% on whatever money they're managing, and they get 20% over the hurdle, right? So on that ongoing basis, these people are getting paid regardless, right? They just need to keep the money active and keep it rolling.
Yeah.
That combined with the fact that if you look at the bios, if you actually look at these investors, it is rare to find an investor that has done a startup. Most of them have gone to Stanford, Harvard, MIT, one of these fancy schools, and they came out of the school and now they can, they're an investor and they work their way up, and it takes them half their life to become a partner, and they've never done a startup. And so their entire perspective of your world view, your worldview as a startup founder is based on their angle, right? From an investor looking into a business, not a founder in the weeds, right? You're there trying to do everything you can, and you're trying to hustle, and you've got some really important things that are going to move the needle. And then they tell you, oh, I need a deck on this or that or the other thing, or you need to raise a round right now. I need you to do this. I need you to do that. And and the balance between the investor and the founder can really be off, and the founder doesn't know any better most of the time, and they're sort of acquiescing to the investor all the time because, ooh, it's the investor. And I got to tell you that most of the time the investor is wrong. You look at the data, it occurs most of the time. I mean, the majority of the time, the recommendations they give you are wrong. And if you look at the market conditions that we're in right now, you could see an example of that. You have companies like Instacart dropping their valuation from 36 billion to 13. Well, they were overvalued. Well, guess who made them overvalued?
If they're lucky, then we are 13.
Right. Yeah. Right. But I mean, this overvaluation is systemic in investors because these guys get the 2 and 20 model, right? The 2% of what they're managing is guaranteed. The 20 isn't, and they know that 90% fail. So because, I've said this before, a lot of them are just lazy. What they do is they throw a whole bunch of stuff up against the wall and they figure out whatever sticks, right? So as a founder, you're on your own. Yeah, they want you to win, but if you're not one of the big winners, they're going to drop you on your head. And this is really obvious in the data. Like, you cannot argue that. And on top of that, if you look at the market conditions, you can see that they drive towards overvaluation. When the market changes, when all that blows up like it just did, then they start switching and they drive to undervaluing companies. And so how can you say that either one of those ways of going about things is beneficial for the founder, right? So what I mean by the investors are not your friends is you need to look out for your own self, and you need to be very careful about the directions that they push you, and you need to see through the reasons why they're pushing you.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I know we are coming to closer to our wrap-up time here, but I wanted to talk a little bit about Boss Capital Partners. You, on the other hand, compared to some of the other investors and VCs, actually have done this and have done this multiple times. So that gives you kind of a front seat mentorship to some of these people, is because you have been in the game, you have played it, you have won several times. How does that help Boss Capital Partners? The fact that you and I'm hoping some of the founders, other co-founders have done that too. And also, what's your investing philosophy? What other companies are you investing in right now?
So I'll start with the last one. We always look for things that are, I call it inch wide, mile deep, right? So,
Okay.
If everybody's looking at blockchain, I'm not.
Sure.
And the reason why is because if you look at a canyon and everybody sees the space between the canyon, they fall into the canyon gets shallower and wider. If they hop over it, it stays narrow and deep, and that keeps competitors out of the space. And so what are the canyons that are narrow and deep? Usually subject matter expert founders working in really boring spaces, right? So, one of our companies is soft legislation software. So they build software that makes it so that different legislative houses around the world have some software that allows them to work back and forth and log things and implement law and integrate and all kinds of stuff, right? They're doing multiple iterations and with multiple people in multiple different areas, including consultants, lawyers, like all kinds of stuff, right? So that's part of it, And then the other part of it is the concept of a business is boring, right? So we have one of ours that's a wastewater, right? So it's water that leaves the systems and then goes out into wastewater treatment plants, and these guys use nitrogen to speed up the bacteria's processing, and then so they don't have to build more wastewater treatment plants. I mean, nobody wants to deal with toilet water, right? Literally. We had one that was in transportation that automated buses, right? So it made it so that you could pay for a bus with your phone through Apple Pay, and the bus would have logistics instead of using tickets like the old days. So they're solving real problems that are sort of boring. Those are the kind of investments that we look for. If somebody comes to us and they're like, we have an an online marketing, fill in the blank, pass, So basically that's what we look for. The other thing that you asked was sort of along the lines of like our philosophy. So outside of the inch mile deep, the philosophy is to actually be honest with the founders, right? So I'll give you an example. We have one of our portfolio companies. They had a problem scaling, so we worked with them and restructured how their functional areas operated, and that required them to hire people in order for them to move from more of a service technology-enabled services model to a SaaS model. Well, like 3 months later, they didn't do it. And, they're coming up on doing another round. And I said, listen, I don't want you guys to have to give up a lot of equity because I can't raise your valuation because you haven't switched over to a SaaS model. And I can see that through your growth margin retention numbers, through your valuation drivers, right? And so what you need to do is you need to get this going, or this is the penalty. And I don't want to have to do that to you. So being honest with them, and just telling them, listen, this is why I'm asking you to do it specifically instead of just broadly like most investors do, because they don't know the details. I go deep with them. I go deep with them and I explain the details. Like, this is why, and this is the penalty for not doing it. And this is how much time you have to fix it. Otherwise, this is what's going to happen. Yeah. And so my philosophy is you don't do a lot of deals. You make sure that the deals you are doing, that you're really working with the founder. Because if you're an investor and you don't want to lose your money, like the VCs, then, and you're going to, actually benefit from, maybe 12, I call them, I do 12. I have a January, February, March, I do one a month, and I have 12 for the year. And then if I lose one or sell one, then I've only lost one actually in my whole life. But whenever, and that was because of COVID, but whenever I exit one, then I fill in one for that month. So it's really working with them and being really honest with them and transparent, and, trying to not be in a situation where you're taking advantage of them. It's so easy to take advantage of these people. It's like hitting a kid, and it's wrong. It's just not okay.
You said one for every month. I'm hoping November and December is open for this year. So.
This year we're filled up for this year. Actually, I'm over. I have 14 or 15, right? I think I have 15 right now. So I'm a little bit past. I had expected on closing a couple, but COVID happened, and then this market condition kind of made it okay. Well, now I gotta, you got to ride it out a little bit. I got to weather the storm.
Makes sense. We have exceeded our time here, Greg, but that was highly, highly informational and invaluable for everyone listening to it, whether you run a startup, whether you are a late stage startup, whether you're thinking of starting a business. That was a masterclass really in how to start, succeed, and exit if that's what you want to do while creating a new company. That, ladies and gentlemen, was Gregory Shepard, who is the co-founder of Boss Capital Partners. And also an author, keynote speaker, and runs his own podcast. So thank you so much, Greg. That was, as I said, that was very invaluable, and appreciate your time taking out and talking to our audience.
Thank you. It's been an honor. I really appreciate it.